My name is Florence Whitmore. I'm 66 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and a widow of 12 years. I've spent my life building a quiet home filled with love, memory, and principle, none of which could prepare me for what happened the day my son got married. The ceremony was lavish. Rows of golden chairs, white roses dripping from archways, crystal glasses catching the early afternoon light. It was held at a private vineyard in Sonoma, somewhere I had never been invited to until today. People in suits and satin dresses bustled from table to table, laughter spilling like champagne. And in the center of it all stood my son Ethan, beaming, confident in his sharp black tuxedo. Standing beside him, Vanessa, his bride, glowed like a porcelain doll. Perfect, composed, the center of attention. I waited patiently during the reception, hands folded over a small gift in my lap. A silver photo frame. Not just any frame. It was the one Henry, my late husband, had gifted me on our first wedding anniversary, engraved with the words, "Forever begins humbly." I had cleaned it, polished it, and placed inside a photo of Ethan as a toddler on his father's shoulders. I thought they might place it somewhere meaningful in their new home. When it was finally my turn, I walked up to the gift table, gently set the frame down, and offered it with a soft smile. Vanessa picked it up, inspected it, then turned it over in her hands like it was something she found in a thrift shop. Her eyebrows arched. "Is this second-hand?" she asked, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was polite, awkward, the kind of laughter people use when they don't want to get involved. I looked at my son. Ethan stepped toward me, his expression stiff. He leaned in close, and what he whispered didn't just bruise. It broke. "Mom, don't make this about you. You're becoming a burden." A burden. I stared at him, at the boy I once fed spoon by spoon when his stomach was too upset to eat. The boy I read bedtime stories to when Henry was deployed overseas. The boy I held through fever and failure and heartbreak. I said nothing. I turned, quietly walked away from the table, and left the room. The sound of celebration grew distant behind me. My hands trembled as I stepped into the vineyard's edge, beyond the lights and the laughter, and into the arms of the night. They laughed, but they didn't know the deed to the mansion they now honeymooned in still bore my name. If you've ever been mocked by someone you raised, someone you gave your life to, stay. You'll want to hear what came next. I sat alone at the far end of the garden, where fairy lights faded into shadows and the music was just a hum. I held the empty gift box in my lap and stared down at the space where their names had been handwritten. Ethan and Vanessa. September 15th. Forever begins. I once believed in forever. I once thought humility would always be seen as grace. But in that moment, I realized something important. Some people mistake kindness for weakness. Some confuse quiet presence with irrelevance. A young server walked past and paused. "Would you like champagne, Mom?" I shook my head. "No, thank you." She lingered, then added, "That was a beautiful frame. I saw it." I looked at her, surprised by the sincerity. "It belonged to my husband," I said. She smiled. "He must have been proud of you." My throat tightened. I nodded and said nothing more. As I left the venue, I walked through a corridor of mirrored panels. In one of them, I caught a glimpse of myself. Modest dress, weathered hands, silver hair pulled back simply. No one in that building saw power. No one saw ownership. No one saw the woman who still held the title to the property they flaunted. But I saw her. and I knew better than to fight with noise. My strength had never been in raising my voice. It had always been in knowing when to wait and when to act. That night, I returned to the house I had shared with Henry. The lights were off. The air was heavy. I took off my shoes, placed the gift box on the kitchen table, and sat down beside the window. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and I remembered a line Henry used to say when Ethan was small and difficult. "You can't teach a man anything in a storm. You wait for silence. That's when the truth sinks in." I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I stared at the frame I had brought back with me. I hadn't meant to take it, but something in me refused to leave it behind. Inside the frame, Ethan's little face smiled back at me, missing front teeth, scraped knees, holding on to his father like a lifeline. I touched the glass gently. The words on the bottom still glinted under the lamplight. "Forever begins humbly." But sometimes, forever is broken by arrogance. And sometimes, humility returns with more power than anyone expects. What they didn't know that night was this: Henry had trusted me, in more ways than Ethan could ever understand. And the home they paraded through, the one they used for photos and speeches and ego, wasn't theirs. Not yet. Not fully. There were papers, there were names, and there were things Vanessa and Ethan hadn't read because they assumed I had nothing to hold. I was the afterthought at their wedding, but soon I would be the one name no one could ignore in court. The envelope came 3 weeks after the wedding, thick, stiff, with the kind of weight that doesn't belong to joy. It was wedged between an electric bill and a coupon flyer, as if the postman had no idea he'd just handed me a betrayal folded in triplicate. I opened it with the butter knife. My hands had stopped shaking long ago, not from strength, but from the muscle memory of getting through things alone. Inside was a stack of papers. The first page was cold in its simplicity. Plaintiff, Ethan Whitmore. Defendant, Florence Whitmore. The air around me didn't move. Not the fan above, not the sheer curtains fluttering near the window. It was as if the house itself had paused in disbelief. I sat down. The next page listed the allegations. Emotional manipulation. Undue influence over shared assets. Obstruction of estate transition. There were words I hadn't heard in decades, legal phrases that twisted the truth until it snapped in half. I read them once, then again, then once more, just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting what I knew couldn't be true. He was suing me. My son was suing me. For everything. The house, the land, the pension account Henry and I had built over 30 years of frugality. Even the small trust Henry had tucked aside for emergencies, hidden behind a line of false budget entries to keep it quiet in case Ethan ever needed it for a crisis. Ethan claimed I was mentally unfit to manage finances, that I'd withheld information about joint assets, that I had interfered with his natural inheritance. The word inheritance felt like sand in my mouth. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a blueprint, a coordinated clinical removal of me from everything we'd built. By the end of the stack, I couldn't feel my legs. My breath was thin, the way it had been the day Henry's doctor called with the scan results. The same numbing disbelief. The same slow descent into a world where nothing made sense. I didn't call anyone. I made tea. The same kind Henry used to brew when Ethan was little. Chamomile, 2 drops of honey. I sat in the kitchen as the kettle hissed, pretending I wasn't alone. The silence was louder than usual. The next day, the news spread faster than I could breathe. At the market, 2 women turned down the canned soup aisle when they saw me. At church, no one offered me a seat. Pastor James skipped my name during the community prayer announcements, though he looked at me twice while reading the list. By the 3rd day, even Martha from next door, a widow like me, someone I used to exchange pies with during the holidays, only nodded once before shutting her door. Being sued by your own son does something strange to people. They look at you differently, not with sympathy, with fear, as if conflict might be contagious. I didn't blame them, but I did take note. I cleaned the house, not because it needed it, but because I needed to remember that I still had control over something. I mopped the floors in the same pattern I'd always used. Top right corner first, move clockwise, end at the front door. I dusted Henry's study. I refolded the linens in the guest room. The papers sat on the dining table for days. Sometimes I walked past and looked at them. Sometimes I didn't. Then, one morning, I opened the drawer beside the frame, the silver one. It still held Ethan's photo. His eyes sparkled the way children's eyes do before they understand how to lie. I placed the frame face down. In the quiet. I thought about the time Ethan broke his arm on the playground and insisted he was fine until I lifted his sleeve and saw the swelling. I thought about when he cried during Henry's funeral and how I had been the one to hold both griefs, his and mine, until he could breathe again. None of that mattered now. Not in court. Not on paper. I stared at the legal documents again. The phrasing. The specific allegations. They were too clean, too professional. Vanessa's family had legal ties. I had overheard it once at dinner. Something about a cousin in litigation. An uncle with offshore holdings. Now it made sense. They were building a case. Not just to take what was mine, but to erase me. I walked outside and stood under the elm tree in the yard. The breeze was sharp that morning, the kind that cut through sweater fabric. I held the envelope against my chest and closed my eyes. A bird landed nearby, just at the edge of the garden. Still, watching. I whispered, "Henry, you wouldn't believe this." And yet, something in me said he would. He always did see things coming before I did. He had warned me, gently, to be cautious with how much we gave Ethan too soon. But love had always made me soft. Too soft, perhaps. I returned to the house, closed the door behind me, and folded the envelope back into its place. Let them come. Let them speak their accusations in a courtroom. Because while they filed papers, they had forgotten something. My name was still on everything. The days after the lawsuit settled into a rhythm of absence. People didn't slam doors in my face or send angry letters. They simply stopped appearing. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, that perhaps the women at Bible study had other plans, that the neighbor's dog wasn't barking because it was napping inside, that Pastor James's silence was due to busyness, not avoidance. But over time, the pattern revealed itself, quiet and undeniable. The phone didn't ring. The church bulletin skipped my name. The weekly produce box from Mrs. Langley's garden stopped arriving on Thursdays. Even my mailbox seemed lighter, as if the world had quietly edited me out of its script. I kept my own script, though. Each morning, I woke at 6, folded the quilt at the foot of my bed, made black tea in Henry's chipped mug, and sat in the same chair facing east. I liked watching the light rise across the neighbor's rooftop. There was something honest about morning light, how it revealed everything without permission. After breakfast, I tidied the house. The guest room sheets stayed fresh. The kitchen stayed clean. The photos remained dust-free. Henry's study, untouched since the day we folded his flag and placed it on the mantel, remained closed except for the moments I needed to remember who I still was. I never once raised my voice. Not when the news reached more distant relatives. Not when Vanessa posted cryptic messages on social media about entitled elders who hoard resources. Not when an old student's mother, someone I once helped during a time of need, crossed the street rather than greet me in town. I stayed quiet. Because some storms, Henry once said, pass only when you stop chasing the rain. It was during one of these quiet mornings that I found myself seated across the kitchen table, my eyes locked on the empty chair opposite me. Henry's chair, the one he used to slide back with a grunt before pouring too much sugar into his oatmeal. It had remained untouched all these years, as though saving a seat for something I could no longer name. I reached for the teacup in front of me. My fingers curled slowly around the handle, but as I lifted it, they trembled more than usual. The tea sloshed slightly, and a few drops hit the saucer with a soft tap. I set it down. The rim of the cup bore a tiny crack, hairline almost imperceptible, like a secret a house keeps from its guest. I stared at it for a long time. The crack reminded me of something I couldn't say out loud. The fracture between what used to be and what now was. A quiet split between the mother I had been and the woman the world had decided I no longer deserved to be. When evening came, I walked to the mailbox, even though I knew there would be nothing inside. Just habit, I suppose. The sky was pale and heavy, a soft gray blanket that promised neither rain nor clarity. I stood at the edge of my lawn and looked out over the street. Empty driveways, shuttered blinds, porches once full of greetings now hollow with stillness. I turned back to the house. As I approached the door, I passed the garden bed Henry had planted. Lavender and sage. He said it kept the air honest. I knelt beside it and pressed my fingers into the soil. It was cool and damp, alive. That night, I didn't sleep much. Instead, I lit a small candle and let it flicker beside the window. Its flame danced against the glass, casting gentle shadows against the wall. Shadows of who I used to be, who I might still become. I didn't speak to the flame. I didn't pray aloud. But somewhere in the silence, I asked a question. What if the world's silence wasn't a punishment, but a pause? A pause wide enough to let me hear myself again. Not the woman they talked about in whispers. Not the defendant on court papers. But the woman who had once written lesson plans until midnight, who had held Henry's hand as the light left his eyes, who had paid bills on time, delivered meals to the sick, held her breath through wars, through funerals, through her son's every heartbreak. That woman still lived here. Quiet didn't mean erased, and being alone didn't mean being finished. It began with a subject line I almost deleted. Veteran relief approval. Action required. I stared at it over breakfast, index finger hovering above the trash icon. Spam, I thought. One of those impersonal notices sent to every widow in a government database. I had received similar emails in the past, reminders for discounted prescriptions or surveys asking how my grief was progressing. Most went unopened, but something about the sender gave me pause. Capital Union Trust. The name rang faintly in my memory, though I couldn't place it. I clicked it open. Inside was a clean message. No greetings, no emotion. Just a notification that my refinancing request had been approved, and a breakdown of new terms, lowered interest rates, and a 3-year grace period. The approval was marked retroactive, dated 2 months before the wedding, but I had never applied for anything. I read it twice, then a third time. Refinance? I stood up, knocking my knee against the table leg. The tea sloshed in its cup, but I didn't stop to wipe it. I opened the drawer where I kept all home documents. Every deed, bill, and tax return since Henry passed was organized there, neatly labeled, clearly dated. I flipped through them with shaking hands. Nothing showed a refinance. No application, no approval form, no communication from Capital Union Trust. I called the bank. The woman on the line introduced herself as Angela, her voice calm and professional. I gave her my name, address, and the last 4 digits of the house account. She placed me on hold for a moment, and I could hear faint keyboard tapping in the background. When she returned, her tone had changed. "Yes, Ms. Whitmore, I see the activity. The refinancing was processed through a third-party lender, then transferred to Capital Union. The paperwork was digitally signed on your behalf." "On my behalf," I repeated slowly. "Yes, ma'am." The power of attorney document was submitted alongside the application. I froze. I never gave power of attorney to anyone. A pause. Angela cleared her throat. "You may want to visit your local branch and request a full audit of the transaction history. I can place a flag for potential fraud if you'd like." I thanked her, politely, calmly, then hung up and sat there for a long time. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. A wind chime tinkled softly against the eaves. Inside, everything was still except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the erratic pulse in my wrist. I returned to my computer and reread the email. At the bottom of the approval form was a legal document attachment. I opened it, heart racing. Scrolling past the technical language, I found what I feared. My name, typed beneath a digital signature. It wasn't mine. It was forged. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Hillside Holdings. The name appeared again on the 4th page, listed as the parent company facilitating the refinance. It sounded familiar, and not in a comforting way. I had heard Ethan mention it once, late at night, when he thought I was asleep on the sofa. "It's through Hillside," he had said. "No red flags. Everything's layered." At the time, I assumed it was startup talk, some business structure jargon. I didn't press. I had stopped, asking questions after too many eye rolls and dismissive shrugs. Now I realized I should have listened harder. I printed the documents and laid them out across the table. Each sheet like a puzzle piece, dry and bureaucratic. But together, they told a story. My house was no longer mine. At least not in the way it used to be. The title had been split, shifted, reassigned. First to Hillside Holdings, then funneled through North Edge Properties, and finally resting with Capital Union as a placeholder trustee. On paper, I was a tenant in the very house I had chosen with Henry. The house we had painted together, brick by brick, one room at a time. The house where Ethan took his first steps, broke his first tooth, built his first science fair project. That same house now belonged to strangers in suits who had never set foot in my garden, never felt the sun through the lace curtains in the reading room. I stood slowly, walked to the front window, and watched as a car passed by. A silver sedan, tinted windows. I didn't recognize it. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe everything was beginning to show itself. I turned away from the glass and looked around the house. Its stillness, its history, its secrets. I wasn't imagining things. I hadn't made this up. Something was happening, and for the first time since the wedding, I felt it deep in my chest, an ember flickering to life beneath the grief and disbelief. They had taken my name off a deed, but they hadn't taken it out of the story. I didn't call ahead. I didn't plan what I would say. I simply folded the forged documents into a manila envelope, put on the gray cardigan Henry used to say made me look like someone with questions, and drove across town to their house. Their new place was all glass and sharp corners, perched on a slope with a view of hills they never hiked. A house too modern to be warm. Vanessa's car was parked in the driveway, sleek and black, a fresh lease. I sat in my car for a moment, steadying my breath, then stepped out and rang the doorbell. Ethan answered. He looked surprised, not alarmed. His shirt was crisp, his expression unreadable. "Mom? I need 10 minutes, I said. He stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled faintly of citrus and expensive candles, the kind that don't smell like anything real. Vanessa appeared at the top of the stairs, her voice light and cool. "Florence, this is a surprise." I didn't respond. I walked into the living room and sat down, placing the envelope on the marble coffee table between us. It looked out of place there, something raw and brown and real amid all the polished stone and curated throw pillows. Ethan sat across from me. Vanessa remained standing, arms folded, watching. I opened the envelope and slid the first page across to Ethan. He picked it up, read. His face didn't change. "You refinanced the house," I said. "Using my name, my documents, a forged power of attorney." He looked at Vanessa, briefly, then back at me. "We were consolidating assets," he said. "It was the logical thing to do. Without asking, you weren't in a position to manage it anymore," Vanessa added. "And let's be honest, Florence, the house was just sitting there." I stared at her, then at Ethan. "I live there," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. "I've lived there every day since your father died. That house—" I stopped myself. "You know what that house is." Ethan exhaled slowly. "We're not trying to hurt you. This was strategic." I looked at my son, the man who once cried when he lost a soccer game in 5th grade, who used to climb into my lap long after he was too big for it. "I'm not an asset," I said. "I'm your mother." Silence stretched between us. Vanessa moved first. She picked up the rest of the documents, scanned them quickly, then tossed them back onto the table like they were irrelevant receipts. "You're overreacting," she said. "This is just paperwork." I looked past her, toward the fireplace. Above it hung a photo from their wedding. The vineyard, the arch of roses, the moment before the laughter. They looked so proud in that picture, so sure of what they were building. "I brought you something once," I said. "A silver frame." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "You mocked it," I continued. "You called me a burden. Then you took everything and turned me into a signature you didn't ask permission to use." He didn't meet my eyes. I stood. Neither of them stopped me. As I turned to leave, I paused by the hallway mirror. My reflection looked back, tired but clear-eyed. I smoothed my hair, straightened my cardigan. Vanessa called after me. "Florence, let's not escalate this. There's no need to make a scene." I looked at her for a long moment. "There's no scene," I said. "Just a story you forgot I still had a voice in." I walked out of their house and into the afternoon light. It wasn't warm, but it was honest. I got into my car, closed the door, and rested my hand on the wheel. There were still things I didn't understand. How deep this went. Who else was involved? But one thing had become painfully clear. They thought I wouldn't fight back. They thought the silence meant surrender. They had mistaken quiet for weak. That night, The house felt colder than usual. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and moved through the rooms like a ghost, retracing the path of a life that no longer fit. Every photo frame stared back with a memory. The scent of old paper and dried lavender lingered in the corners. I made tea out of habit. The kettle whistled gently, and I pulled down my favorite porcelain cup from the top shelf. White with a faded blue rim. Henry bought it for me on our 20th anniversary during a roadside antique stop. It was chipped at the base, but I never minded. Some things are lovelier with flaws. I poured the water, slowly, letting the steam rise into the dim kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked steady, and I clutched the cup with both hands, seeking warmth. But halfway to the table, the handle slipped from my fingers. The porcelain struck the floor with a sharp crack. I froze. Shards scattered across the tiles, the tea pooling like a quiet confession. My knees met the floor a moment later, hands trembling as I reached to collect the pieces. One by one, I placed them on a paper towel, ignoring the sting as a sharp edge brushed my palm. Then I saw it. Behind the hutch, barely visible under the edge of the cabinet, something protruded from the wall. I leaned closer. A corner of aged paper, yellowed and curling, stuck between the molding and the floorboard. My fingers moved without thinking. I pulled it free. It was a letter. Not just any letter. I recognized the handwriting instantly. Neat, deliberate strokes. Ink slightly faded, but unmistakably his. Henry. The envelope had no stamp, no address. Just my name. Written in the center. Florence. I sat there on the kitchen floor, tea soaking into my sleeve, broken porcelain beside me, and carefully opened the flap. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice. I unfolded it, hands shaking, heart louder than the room around me. If they ever turn against you, remember, silence is not surrender. Justice is not loud. It waits. It watches. It writes itself in ink, not in noise. Don't let them pull you out of who you are. The strength is in staying still long enough to see what moves. I read the words again, then again. Tears blurred the paper, and I pressed it gently against my chest, as if holding it close could bring his voice back. I could hear it, in the way memory always protects what grief cannot destroy. Calm, steady. The voice that guided me through every storm. I sat on the floor for a long while, not broken, not quite, just still. When I finally stood, I folded the letter with reverence and slid it into the silver photo frame, the same one from the wedding, the one they laughed at. I removed the picture of Ethan and replaced it with the letter. The glass covered the words like a shield. I placed the frame back on the mantel, beneath the soft glow of the lamp. The living room looked different now. Not brighter, not safer, but steadier. There was a reason Henry had hidden that letter, a reason he hadn't mailed it, hadn't left it out in the open. Because he knew, not just about Ethan, but about the world, about how silence was sometimes the most powerful sound. I walked through the house, turning off lights room by room. My feet moved slower, more deliberate. I wasn't drifting anymore. I was anchoring. Before bed, I opened Henry's study. The room smelled of old leather and cedar. His favorite pen still rested in its tray. I pulled out a notepad and began to write. Not a letter, not a journal entry, but a list. A simple list of every document I had, every account, every signature I remembered authorizing. Then I added a second list, everything that didn't match, everything that had changed without my permission. And at the top of that second list, I wrote a name, Hillside Holdings. I underlined it twice. Then I folded the paper and slid it into the same folder where I'd kept the lawsuit documents. Something had been broken tonight, but it wasn't just a teacup. It was a spell. The one that had kept me quiet, polite, waiting. Something else had taken its place now. A voice. Not loud, not angry, but steady, certain, and ready. The next morning, I called Margaret Jensen. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Life, time, and unspoken grief had stretched the space between us. But Margaret wasn't just a friend. Before she retired, she was the senior account manager at the local branch of South Federal Bank, and the only person I ever trusted with our joint accounts when Henry was still alive. She answered after 3 rings. "Florence?" Her voice held that familiar mix of surprise and concern. "I need to ask a favor," I said, "and I need it to stay quiet." By noon, I was seated in the back office of the bank, tucked between 2 filing cabinets and an old fax machine. Margaret closed the door gently, drew the blinds, and turned the monitor toward me. "All right," she said. "Let's start from the beginning." I handed her the printed documents from the refinance and the forged power of attorney. She adjusted her glasses and read in silence. "I remember seeing Hillside Holdings before," she said finally, tapping the screen. "They've been moving money around using a chain of shell corporations. Not illegal on the surface, but questionable." She entered a few access codes and pulled up a ledger. "There," she said, pointing to a transaction dated 2 months prior. "Your property title was moved through Hillside, then transferred to North Edge Capital. From there, it was funneled through Arvos Trust, which is managed offshore." I leaned in, absorbing the names. None of them meant home. None of them meant safety. She kept scrolling. "I also see activity involving the Whitmore Veteran Education Fund," she murmured. I looked at her. "That's Henry's scholarship grant." She nodded grimly. "It was drained last month, 60,000, transferred in small amounts to a Hillside-linked development fund, listed under infrastructure startup support." My stomach turned. That fund had helped 6 veterans go back to school over the past 3 years. It was one of Henry's last wishes, that the money continue quietly helping people long after he was gone. I pressed my lips together to keep from shaking. Margaret reached across the desk and covered my hand. "This isn't just mismanagement, Florence," she said softly. "This is coordinated, clean, and hidden behind enough paper to bury a body." We both sat in silence for a moment. Then I asked, "Can I get copies of these transactions?" She hesitated. "Technically, no, but I can print you a list of publicly accessible filings, things you're legally entitled to under the original joint ownership." She rose and stepped into the next room. While she printed, I looked around the office. On the far wall hung a photo of a sailboat, drifting peacefully across blue water. Beneath it, a quote, "In calm or storm, the compass remains true." I stared at that for a long time. When Margaret returned, she handed me a file, thick, stapled, annotated with sticky notes. "Start here. These are the cracks." I nodded, tucking the folder into my bag. As I stood to leave, she added, "You were always the quiet one in our group, Florence, but you listened better than the rest of us ever did." I managed a small smile. Quiet doesn't mean blind. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table and laid the papers out in rows, each one built on the last. Account shifts, property records, ownership trail, fraudulent signatures. What began as a feeling had grown into a map of betrayal disguised in corporate language. I opened Henry's ledger from the study. Inside were old notes he used to take when reviewing taxes. He had sketched out diagrams, how assets were supposed to flow, what belonged where, what he wanted to preserve for the future. I followed his lines, cross-checked the new ones, and highlighted everything that no longer matched. Then I began writing. Not a letter, not a journal, a timeline. Each entry had a date, a name, and a transaction. Then I highlighted one phrase: trust deed, joint tenancy with right of survivorship. I remembered Henry insisting we file it that way. "This protects you," he'd said, years ago, as we sat across from the notary. "If something happens, it all goes to you. No loopholes." That phrase was missing in every document Ethan had submitted. I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but resolve. They had underestimated the woman who taught fifth graders how to diagram legal sentences and balance school budgets with $25. They thought I wouldn't find the threads, but I was finding them, one by one, and I was tying them into a noose they wouldn't see coming until it was too late. It started with whispers. First at the grocery store, where a cashier I'd known for years suddenly pretended not to see me. Then at church, where my usual pew sat empty except for the folded bulletin placed where I used to sit. By the third Sunday, they stopped handing me one altogether. No one asked questions. No one offered warmth. And that was the most painful part: how quickly people accepted the narrative they were given. Florence Whitmore, the mother being sued by her only son. The woman who must have done something unspeakable, something that turned her child against her. Because that's how it always goes, doesn't it? People need a reason, and silence gives them room to invent one. I kept walking my usual route in the mornings, even though no one waved anymore. The couple on Maple Street pulled their dog close as I passed. Mrs. Dalton, who once borrowed my pie dish for every Thanksgiving, turned her back while watering her hydrangeas. They weren't cruel, they were careful, as if my presence carried contagion. I didn't blame them, not really. When I returned home, the mailbox held a plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was a single sheet: voluntary surrender of interest, encouraged for avoidance of litigation expenses, typed neatly in bold. No signature, no instructions, just a suggestion: leave quietly, and we'll make this easier. I placed it beside the documents from the bank, the forged refinance, and the timeline I'd started building. The file had grown thicker each day, filled with tiny betrayals that looked like business. In the evening, I sat in the living room and turned on the lamp beside Henry's chair. The letter he had written, the one I found behind the cabinet, was still in the silver frame on the mantel. I read it again, mouthing the words without sound. Silence is not surrender. I pressed my palm to the glass, then walked to the bedroom. I reached into the drawer where I kept my wedding ring. I hadn't worn it since the lawsuit. For weeks, I'd told myself it was just habit. The band was loose anyway. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd taken it off because the weight of memory had started to ache. That night, I held it in my palm. Gold, smooth, faded from years of cooking, gardening, holding on to someone through storms. I placed it on the nightstand and climbed into bed without it. The room felt colder. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan as a boy, running barefoot across the backyard, yelling with joy, his shoelaces dragging behind. I remembered how he'd once asked me, "What happens if you love someone and they don't love you back anymore?" I'd answered without thinking, You love them anyway. You just stop expecting them to notice. Now I wondered if I had taught him the wrong kind of love. By morning, the ring was still on the nightstand. I left it there. Later that day, I tried calling Margaret again, but the line went straight to voicemail. I imagined what might happen if someone had found out she helped me, if they'd pressured her to stay quiet. The pressure was everywhere now. I was no longer being sued. I was being erased. One social cue at a time. I walked into the garden and stood in the patch Henry had planted with lavender. Most of it had dried, its purple faded to gray. I pulled a few brittle stems and let the scent rise. It reminded me of afternoons spent clipping herbs for dinner, the way Henry used to hum under his breath. Standing there, barefoot in the soil, I felt the ache not just of loss, but of distance. Not between me and Ethan, but between who I had been and who the world now believed I was. I returned to the house and sat at the kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of me. For the first time, I didn't know what to write. Not a note, not a journal entry, not a list. Just silence. So I folded the page in half, then again, and slid it into the folder. Even blank, it belonged in the file. It was a record of what they had tried to take. Not just my home, but my presence. And I was going to remind them, piece by piece, that I was still here. It was a Tuesday when I followed the trail to something larger. I'd been sifting through bank statements and transaction reports all morning, my eyes dry from hours of staring at printed lines that looked more like a code than money. But one line item caught my attention, not because of the amount, but because of the recipient. Arvos International. I had seen it before, buried deep in the corporate filings that Margaret had flagged. At first, I'd assumed it was another shell, one more mask in the costume party of corporate deception. But something about the name stayed with me. I opened Henry's old laptop. It still ran, though slowly, humming like an old radio trying to tune in. I searched for Arvos International. Dozens of results appeared, most of them vague or hidden behind paywalls. But one link led to an archived news article from 7 years ago. The headline stopped me cold. Congressional hearings question. Arvos International's alleged links to espionage funding. My hand froze on the mouse. I clicked through, heart thudding. Arvos International, based nominally out of Luxembourg, had been investigated for its connection to tech startups accused of funneling U.S. data overseas. The hearings had gone nowhere, no formal charges, no smoking gun. But buried in the article was a list of shell corporations used to hide funding sources. One of them was Hillside Holdings. The room tilted slightly. I leaned back in my chair, let the air settle in my lungs, and stared at the screen. It wasn't just shady finances. It wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law and a weak son. This was part of something wider, something darker. I clicked open my timeline and added a new column, Ties to Arvos. I scrolled through my notes, the refinancing, the grant money, the property shuffle. Each time Hillside appeared, it led to a transfer, a new account, a vanishing record, and now, Arvos. The more I connected, the less it looked like coincidence. I emailed Margaret, short and direct. Did you know about Arvos? Please confirm, discreetly. Then I printed everything, just in case. That evening, I sat in the study with the lamp casting a warm circle of light over Henry's desk. I laid out the papers like a puzzle, lines drawn from one entity to another, red ink highlighting every overlap. The names changed, But the game remained the same. Buried in one document from North Edge, I spotted a signature. Not Ethan's, Vanessa's, her maiden name. Suddenly, it made sense. She had never left her father's corporate umbrella. I remembered now, her father worked in international finance. She had always downplayed it. "He's boring," she used to joke. "All spreadsheets and offshore meetings." I hadn't asked questions then, but now I could see it. They had looped Ethan in just enough to make him useful. His name on the deed, his signature on the shell transfers, his charm as a buffer between legality and the truth. But he wasn't the architect. Vanessa was. And Arvos was the blueprint. I stood from the desk and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet. But something about the silence had changed. It no longer felt like neglect. It felt like surveillance, as though someone, somewhere, was waiting to see how much I knew. I pulled the curtain closed. Later that night, the porch light flickered twice before going out. I stepped outside and found nothing broken, but the feeling lingered, like a breath held just behind the trees. I went back in, locked the door, and sat down with Henry's letter once more. Justice is not loud. It waits. It watches. It writes itself in ink, not in noise. I underlined that line and made another copy of the letter, placing one inside the folder with the documents and another in the hollow book we kept on the bookshelf, the one we used to hide spare keys and old savings bonds. I didn't know who was watching, but I knew now that I wasn't just dealing with family betrayal. This wasn't just about inheritance or ego. It was about access, control, and erasure. And they thought I would crumble under it. They didn't understand the strength of someone who had waded through deployments, raised a child during lonely winters, and paid off every mortgage bill with a teacher's salary. I could wait longer, but I wouldn't wait silently anymore. The first call came just after midnight. I was in the kitchen, penning notes by the soft glow of the lamp, when the phone rang once and stopped. The sound startled me more than it should have. I stared at the receiver, waiting. After a few seconds, it rang again. Short, clipped. I picked it up. A man's voice, low, measured. No greeting. "Walk away." I didn't answer. "You've gone far enough," he continued. "Close your folder. Stay out of what doesn't belong to you." Then silence. A click. The line went dead. I replaced the receiver slowly, like it might break if I set it down too quickly. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls pressing in. I poured the rest of my tea down the sink and stood there, palms flat on the counter, letting the tap water run over my fingers until they steadied. By morning, a car was parked across the street. Black, windows tinted, engine off. The kind of car that doesn't belong on our block of aging colonials and modest sedans. It sat there for hours, then rolled away when I stepped outside to collect the mail. Inside the mailbox was another envelope. This one empty, save for a single photograph of my house taken from the street, printed on glossy paper. No note, just the image. I held it a long time before sliding it into the folder with the rest of the evidence. Later that afternoon, another call. Same low voice. "You're making a mistake, Ms. Whitmore. You're not equipped for this. People get hurt." I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of his breathing on the other end. Calm, certain, like someone who believed he held all the cards. When he finished, I said only one word. "No." I hung up. That evening, I sat at the dining table with Henry's letter. The paper had begun to soften at the folds from how many times I'd opened it. I read the line again. The strength is in staying still long enough to see what moves. I pressed the letter flat and placed my palm over the ink, as if drawing power from it. Then I opened the Bible Henry had given me on our wedding day, the one with the worn leather cover. Inside the front flap, he had written a single phrase in his careful hand. Hold the line. I traced the words with my finger. Hold the line. I had taught my students that some lines aren't drawn to divide, but to protect. That sometimes the only way to hold dignity is to hold still, even when everything pushes you to run. That night, as the streetlights flickered outside, I made myself a promise. I would not run. I would not surrender. I would not let their silence replace mine. I folded the photograph of my house and placed it beside the letter. I slid them both into a plastic sleeve and tucked it into the bottom of the file box. Then I locked the box with a small brass key and placed it back in the study, behind the row of old encyclopedias. When I returned to the kitchen, the phone rang again. This time I didn't answer. I watched it ring, then stop. Outside the window, the black car idled once more under the street lamp, its headlights off, a shadow among shadows. I drew the curtain and whispered aloud for the first time in weeks, "Henry, I'm still here." The house creaked as the night air shifted. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bird stirred and went quiet again. I straightened my shoulders. Fear had once knelt at my husband's grave. It would kneel again. I found Grace's number in an old Rolodex tucked behind Henry's tax files, just where he always said it would be. Her handwriting hadn't changed, slanted and steady, like the woman herself. We hadn't spoken in years, but I didn't hesitate. I dialed. She picked up on the third ring. "Florence Whitmore," she said, not a question. Her voice was soft, but carried that same deliberate weight I remembered from our college days, the kind of voice that made people sit up straighter. "I need help," I said. "Where?" she replied. By dusk, she was at my door. She wore a beige overcoat and carried a leather briefcase worn thin at the corners. Her gray hair was pulled back in a low knot. No makeup, no pretense. She stepped into the living room, without ceremony, and stood before the mantel, eyes falling immediately on the silver frame and the letter within it. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer condolences. She simply said, "Show me what you've got." I laid out the documents across the dining table. Transaction trails, forged signatures, the refinance approvals, the charity fund withdrawals, even the photo of my house that arrived in the mail. Grace stood over them, reading each page in complete silence. Her finger traced the hillside filings, the offshore transfers, the North Edge records. Every now and then she made a quiet sound in her throat. Approval, disapproval, it was hard to tell. After nearly an hour, she looked up. "You've got enough for a hearing," she said. "Possibly enough for a subpoena chain, but you'll need to formalize the timeline." "I've started," I said, pointing to my notes. She nodded. "Good. We'll need an affidavit. The Department of Justice won't move without one, and we'll need to prove the digital power of attorney was forged." "They used a template," I said, "filed it under my maiden name." Grace raised an eyebrow. "That's sloppy." "Useful." She sat down and opened her briefcase. Inside was a slim laptop, already powered on. "Let's build your declaration. Start with when the mail came." For the next 2 hours we worked. I spoke. She typed. She asked questions. Clinical, exact. "Date of refinance notice?" "Who held the original deed?" "Was your signature on file with the title office?" I answered, grateful for the first time in weeks to be in the company of someone who didn't flinch. Grace had always been like that. In college, she was the one who stayed calm when protests turned chaotic. The one who knew which forms to file, who to call, what to quote. She never raised her voice, but when she spoke, deans and judges listened. When we finished the declaration, she reviewed it line by line, her voice a low hum of focus. "You've documented the pattern," she said. "Now we hit them with sequence, cause and effect, intent." I handed her the copy of Henry's original will, the one we had notarized years ago. She scanned it quickly, then froze. "This line," she said, "joint tenancy with right of survivorship. This protects you." "I thought so," I replied. She set the paper down. "Then their entire claim to the house is built on fraud. The court's going to see that." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Grace leaned back in her chair, the briefcase still open beside her. "You're not just fighting to keep a house, Florence. You're building a case that could expose an entire network." "I know. And if you go forward," she added, "you'll need to be ready for discovery. They'll come after you harder, especially if they think you can take down more than just a deed." I folded my hands together. "They already have." She studied me for a long moment. Then she smiled, the corners of her mouth lifting ever so slightly. "Still the same woman who used to outline ethics cases better than our professors." I smiled back. "Still the same woman who ate cold spaghetti out of a mug during finals week." She chuckled. "And still fighting." We signed the final draft of the declaration together, her name as witness, mine as declarant. The printer hummed softly in the background as the affidavit emerged, warm from the ink. Grace slid it into a protective folder and handed it to me. "You'll file this first. Then I'll submit for subpoena returns on all financial records tied to Hillside, North Edge, and Arvos. Once we get the chain of custody, we'll be ready." I looked down at the folder in my hands. It wasn't heavy, but it carried weight. "You sure you're okay doing this with me?" I asked. "I didn't come out of retirement for a favor," she said. "I came because you were always the one who stood up when no one else did." She rose, gathering her things. "Justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be signed." She paused at the door, turned to me. "Hold the line." I nodded. And I would. It was just after 5 the next morning when I unlocked the cedar trunk in Henry's study. I hadn't opened it in years, not since the summer Ethan left for college. The hinges creaked like old bones. Inside were familiar things: faded uniforms, a wooden box of medals, a pressed sprig of lavender folded into a letter from our first anniversary. At the very bottom, beneath a sealed envelope marked House 1989, I found what I didn't know I'd been looking for. A smaller envelope, worn, yellowing, labeled in Henry's handwriting, "If Florence ever needs this." My breath caught. I carried it into the living room and sat down at the table, hands trembling as I opened the seal. Inside were 2 items. The first was a letter. The second, a copy of our will. Not the copy I'd kept in the drawer. This one was older, but the ink was dark, the signature wet and deliberate. Henry's signature, mine just below. I unfolded the letter first. "My love, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. And I wasn't there to steady the wheel. You were always the one who believed people would do right if you gave them the chance. But just in case they don't, this is your proof. The house is yours, entirely. I've filed it with survivorship rights. No contest should undo that. If anyone tries, remind them that real strength doesn't scream. It signs papers. It tells the truth. It keeps receipts. Trust deeds, not words." I folded the letter back carefully and placed it beside the copy of the will. The room felt different. Not lighter, but clearer. Like someone had opened a window after a long rain. I examined the will, scanning every line. The clause was right there, exactly as Grace had said it should be. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Filed, witnessed, notarized. I traced Henry's signature with the tip of my finger. It was steady, confident. He had always known how to protect things. Sometimes I hated how prepared he'd been for the worst. But now I was grateful. Beyond words. A car passed outside. I didn't bother checking which one. I took the will to the kitchen, lit the stove, and made a pot of coffee. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the bitterness cling to my throat. Instead, I felt something else. Readiness. Later that morning, I met Grace at the courthouse. She had already arranged the appointment with the clerk. We filed the affidavit, then walked to the recorder's office, where I presented the notarized will. The woman behind the desk looked over the document, flipping carefully through the pages. "This hasn't been challenged before?" she asked. "No," I replied, "because I didn't need it before." She nodded, stamped the copy, and entered it into the system. Grace and I stepped back out into the sunlight. "That's it," she said. "Now we have chain of custody." I nodded, clutching the manila folder to my chest. Grace glanced sideways at me. "You're going to need to be sharp in court. They'll try to spin the narrative, paint you as unfit or erratic." "They already have," I said. "They just don't realize I kept the original narrative." Back home, I sat on the porch with the will in my lap and Henry's letter beside it. Across the street, the black car was gone. For the first time in days, I watched the wind stir the leaves, lifting dust from the sidewalk, nudging the chimes on the neighbor's porch just enough to break the silence. Then I rose and walked into the house, taking the steps slowly. In the bedroom, I retrieved my wedding ring from the nightstand. I held it in my hand, turned it once, then slid it back onto my finger. It didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt right. After dinner, I moved the silver frame from the mantel to the shelf beside the door. Just beneath it, I placed the original will inside a folder marked "For Judge's Review." Then I picked up the folder of evidence, bank records, shell company filings, the forged documents, the photo of my house, and stacked it neatly on top. I added one last note, handwritten in block letters. "Truth is already filed." I closed the folder, locked the box, and turned off the light. The storm hadn't passed yet. But now I had something stronger than fear. I had proof. I ironed my blouse before the sun came up. Not because anyone would care how it looked, but because I needed something pressed and clean, something controlled. The fabric was soft cotton, off-white with a narrow collar, simple, modest, and mine. In the quiet kitchen, I packed the file box carefully. The affidavit Grace had prepared sat on top, followed by Henry's letter, the notarized will, and the sequence of transactions I had mapped by hand. I'd added sticky, notes in blue for the forged documents, yellow for property transfers, and pink for the scholarship fund withdrawals. Grace said it wasn't necessary. I said it helped me think. At the bottom of the box, beneath every document and chart, I tucked the photo Ethan had drawn in second grade, me and Henry holding his hands at a park. 3 stick figures smiling under a crooked sun. I didn't need it for court, but I needed it for me. By mid-morning, Grace arrived to review everything once more. She carried 2 folders of her own and a small box of backup printouts. She had a black scarf tied at her throat, a habit from her litigation days. She glanced around the kitchen. "You're calm." "I'm ready," I said. We sat at the table, side by side, reviewing each item. Grace pointed to the subpoena returns. "These show the money trail. And the affidavit covers my testimony under oath." "Right. The will gives you ownership. The forged power of attorney shows intent. And the letter from Henry, while not legally binding, adds context." I nodded. "Do you think the judge will listen?" Grace smiled without looking up. "Judges listen better than juries. They see through theater. What we have here isn't drama, it's documentation." I slipped Henry's letter into the inside pocket of my blazer. "Taken that with you?" she asked. "Yes, it doesn't need to be read. Just held." She nodded. We walked out together. The sun was sharp against the pavement, and the breeze carried the scent of something dry and waking. Dust and dogwood, maybe. It reminded me of old schoolyards in spring, before the year turned over and everything bloomed again. At the courthouse steps, Grace paused. "If anything happens," she said, "speak simply. Speak only the truth. Don't speculate. Don't accuse. Just confirm what's on paper." I looked at her. That's all I've ever had. Inside, the waiting room was quiet. A few other cases were docketed that morning, mostly estate hearings and family disputes. A bailiff checked us in, polite but distant. He handed me a small card with my case number. Case 489B, Whitmore v. Whitmore. My fingers brushed the edge of the card. It felt heavier than it should. Ethan was already there. He sat 3 chairs away, scrolling on his phone, his tie slightly askew. Vanessa sat beside him, whispering something into his ear. Her heels clicked as she crossed her legs, the sound sharp in the silence. He didn't look at me. Neither did she. I didn't expect them to. Grace sat between us, a quiet wall of reason. The clerk called us in. Courtroom 2B was small, no gallery, just 1 row of benches, 2 tables, and a raised bench where the judge sat reviewing documents through rimless glasses. She didn't look up as we entered. Ethan and Vanessa's attorney, a man I hadn't met, stood and introduced himself formally. Grace did the same. The judge finally looked up. "Let's begin." Their lawyer started with a list of claims: financial mismanagement, misallocation of family assets, mental instability due to grief. The words came out smoothly, like reading from a menu. I watched Ethan's face as the lawyer spoke. He didn't look angry. He looked absent. When it was our turn, Grace handed the affidavit to the clerk and stepped aside. I rose. The judge motioned me forward. I placed the folder on her bench. Inside was everything. She opened it, adjusted her glasses, and began reading. The room held its breath. She didn't rush. Her eyes moved steadily across each page, pausing now and then to underline, flip, compare. When she reached the will, she stopped. Her brow lifted slightly. "Joint tenancy with right of survivorship," she read aloud. Grace nodded. "Filed, notarized, and never revoked." The judge looked to Ethan's lawyer. "Did your team verify this document prior to submitting your claim?" He hesitated. "We were unaware of a second copy, Your Honor." "It's not a second copy," I said softly. "It's the original, the one filed with the recorder's office yesterday." The judge's gaze shifted to me. "And who is currently residing in the property?" "I am," I said. "And I always have." She nodded once. "Please be seated." I returned to my chair. She continued reading. Grace leaned in. "She's seeing it," she whispered. "Every line." I nodded, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The room was quiet, but full of everything we had brought, everything we had prepared. and beneath my blazer, I could feel the edge of Henry's letter pressing gently against my chest. The courtroom held a silence that buzzed like tension in the walls. The judge lowered the final document and removed her glasses. Her face didn't reveal much, but the way she leaned back in her chair said enough. She had seen through the noise. "I've reviewed the affidavit, the will, and the accompanying evidence," she began, voice even. "The claims made by the plaintiff rest on assumptions that this court finds unsubstantiated." Ethan shifted in his chair. Vanessa sat perfectly still, hands crossed in her lap, lips tight. The judge turned to their attorney. "You submitted a claim of misappropriation based on power of attorney, yet the power of attorney was forged, confirmed by digital timestamp inconsistencies and the absence of a physical original." Their lawyer fumbled. "Your Honor, the documents were handled by an intermediary. My clients believed—" She cut him off. "Belief is not a legal defense." I sat still, eyes on the bench, hands folded. The judge continued. "Furthermore, the deed transfer was funneled through Hillside Holdings, a shell company previously linked to other filings currently under DOJ review." A ripple moved through the room. I turned slightly toward Ethan. His eyes had changed. No longer cold, no longer smug, just wide. She lifted a separate folder. "And, finally, the existence of a valid joint tenancy with right of survivorship renders any claim to ownership by the plaintiff invalid. The property, by law and by documentation, belongs solely to the defendant." Vanessa broke the stillness. She leaned toward Ethan, whispering fast, sharp. He didn't respond. The judge continued. "Based on this evidence, I will be referring this case to federal authorities for further investigation into financial fraud, forgery, and potential elder exploitation." The lawyer tried to object. She raised her hand. "Don't. I've seen enough." She looked at me. Her voice softened slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you have anything you wish to say?" I rose slowly. "Only this," I said. "I didn't come here to take anything from anyone. I came to protect what was already mine." The judge nodded once. "Understood." Then she turned to the bailiff. "Please notify the U.S. Marshals. Have DOJ agents on standby." And then, to everyone's surprise, including mine, she added firmly, "Close the doors." 2 officers near the entrance turned and secured them with a solid clunk. The room seemed to freeze. Vanessa stood abruptly. "Excuse me, what is this? We're not criminals." The judge ignored her. "Per order of the court, all present are to remain seated until further instructions are issued by the Justice Department liaison." Ethan looked up, color draining from his face. "I didn't know," he said, barely audible. The judge responded without emotion. "Then perhaps you should have read what you were signing." The doors swung open again, not from retreat, but from arrival. 3 plainclothes federal agents entered, badges visible. One of them walked straight to the bench, exchanged a folder with the judge, then turned toward the table where Ethan and Vanessa sat. "Ethan Whitmore. Vanessa Whitmore. You're being placed under federal investigation for financial conspiracy and fraud, pending further detainment for questioning." Vanessa began to protest. Her voice cracked under pressure, but no one listened. The officers moved with precision, calm, efficient. Vanessa flinched as cuffs clicked into place behind her back. Ethan didn't resist. He simply lowered his head as if finally realizing the full weight of what he'd allowed. The entire courtroom was still. I didn't look away, because I needed to see it, not for revenge, but for confirmation, that the truth had not just been spoken, but upheld. One of the agents approached the bench and handed the judge a document. Protective orders filed for all individuals listed under financial threat, including the defendant and any seniors connected to the Whitmore Veterans Fund. The judge nodded. Approved. I stepped forward, quietly. "Your Honor," I said, voice steady, "I'd like to formally request protective custody be extended to the beneficiaries of the Veterans Scholarship Fund. Most are elderly. Many don't even know they were at risk." She glanced at me, thoughtful. "That will be noted and added to the order." Grace touched my arm. I hadn't even noticed her stand. The agents led Ethan and Vanessa toward the exit, escorted through the now silent room. As Ethan passed, he turned his head. For a second, he met my eyes. There was no hatred there, just something else, something softer. Then they were gone. The judge stood, gathered her papers, and exited through the back door without fanfare. The court clerk began filing out documents. It was over. I stayed in my seat as the room slowly emptied. Grace leaned over, voice low. "You did it." I nodded. We did. We walked out together into the light. It was near midday now. The courthouse steps were warm underfoot. Somewhere across town, I imagined the black car had already disappeared, and with it, the fear that had lived on my street for weeks. Back home, I set the file box on the table. Then I pulled out the photo from Ethan's childhood, the stick figure version of us. I placed it beside the folder, not to forget, but to remember. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the silence of isolation, but the stillness that comes after a storm has passed. The file box sat on the shelf beside the silver frame, closed, untouched since court. I hadn't opened it in days. I didn't need to. Justice had been served. The days that followed moved slowly. The porch felt warmer. The tea tasted softer. I slept more soundly than I had in months. Neighbors, once distant, began nodding again. A few even stopped to speak. Small gestures, a pie on the doorstep. A note slipped into the mailbox. "We were wrong. We see you now." I didn't need the apologies, but I appreciated them just the same. The black car never returned. Neither did the whispers. Only the sunlight returned, falling across the same floors I'd swept for decades, turning corners golden again. There was healing in the ordinary, in washing dishes, folding clothes, hearing birdsong outside the window. But it wasn't until I found the letter that I realized how deep the healing could reach. It arrived on a Thursday. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in a careful scrawl across a plain envelope. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening it. The sun had just dipped below the trees, and the light across the tile was soft and low. Inside was a single page, folded neatly. No salutation, no signature. Just the words. "You carried me when I mocked your weight. You held me when I had nothing but teeth and tantrums. You fed me when I lied to your face. You forgave me more than I deserved. And then I called you a burden. I became the burden." My hands trembled. I kept reading. They told me you'd never fight back, that you didn't understand, that we'd bury it in paper and loopholes and you'd fade away. But you didn't. You stood still, and the world moved around you until the truth settled where it always belonged. I set the page down and pressed my hand to my chest. The tears came before I could stop them. Not loud, not sharp, just steady, like the sea smoothing stones. "I'm sorry, Mom. Not because I lost, but because you deserved better than who I became. I'm learning now, slowly. There's space here in this place. time I can't waste anymore. If I ever get out, I hope I still know how to sit on your porch and listen. I hope you'll still have tea." I folded the letter gently. Then I walked to the mantel, where Henry's letter still rested in the silver frame. Beside it, I placed this new one. 2 letters. One from the man who had taught me how to hold the line. The other from the boy I had raised, finally learning what that line meant. That night, I lit a single candle in the window. Just as I had when Henry was overseas, when Ethan was young, and when silence was the only answer I had. Only this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. The next morning, I stood on the porch with a fresh cup of tea and watched the lights stretch across the lawn. The lavender had started to bloom again, pale and soft. A signal, maybe, that some things return when we least expect them. I wrote Ethan back. Short, simple. "When the time is right, come home. The porch is still here. So is the tea." I didn't know when or if he would return, but I knew that forgiveness didn't always need a door to swing wide. Sometimes it only needed a window and a light left on. I slid the letter into an envelope and dropped it into the mailbox with steady hands. Then I went inside and poured myself another cup, not out of habit, but out of hope. The courthouse victory wasn't the end of the story. It was the clearing. The path that followed was quiet, but deliberate. Step by step, I began building something that felt like restoration, not just for myself, but for others who had once sat where I had, wondering if the world had simply forgotten them. It started with a call to the county clerk's office, then a visit to a nonprofit that provided legal aid to low-income seniors. Then another meeting, this time with a young woman named Lila, whose mother had nearly lost her home after being tricked into signing a predatory loan. And before I knew it, my afternoons were filled again, not with fear or shame, but with purpose. I called it the Sentinel Foundation. Grace helped with the paperwork. Margaret returned to help with financial compliance. The woman who used to turn her back at the post office now showed up every week with donations and warm muffins. Word spread faster than I could keep up. We began small, helping 3 seniors contest suspicious property liens. Then 5 more needed help appealing forged guardianship claims. Then 7 needed someone simply to sit beside them in court. We did that too. The Sentinel Foundation didn't have an office at first. Just my living room, a folding table, and the smell of lavender from the garden. But it was enough. People came not because of a sign out front, but because they heard someone would listen. Someone who understood what it meant to be quietly erased. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a woman named Maria, 3 counties over. Her words were shaky, uncertain, but she ended with a sentence that stayed with me. "I didn't think people like you existed. I thought silence meant I had to go quietly." I wrote her back. "Silence doesn't mean defeat. It means we're still gathering strength." In time, the stories piled up. A man who reclaimed his father's land after a fraudulent deed transfer. A widow who got her savings back from a nephew who drained her account. A couple who hadn't spoken to their daughter in years, now back in contact after learning the truth behind forged legal papers meant to divide them. Each story became part of something larger. And so did I. At first, I didn't know what to do with the attention. Local papers wanted interviews. A university invited me to speak to their social justice class. I declined most of them. But I said yes to the nursing home that asked me to come read aloud on Sundays. I read Henry's letter once. Just once. And when I looked up, 3 people were crying. They asked me to read it again the next week. I said yes. The donations grew. Not just money, but stories. Stories people wanted to share. Not in bitterness, but in dignity. Survivors, not victims. Not statistics. People like me. I printed every letter, every photo, every thank you card, and placed them in a single binder. Sentinel, Volume 1. It sat beside the silver frame now, and every time I passed it, I remembered. One morning, I received an envelope from a woman I didn't recognize. Inside was a note and a check. My mother passed 2 months ago. She died peacefully, thanks to the help your foundation gave her. I'm sending what little I can to help someone else stay in their home. My mother always said, "That woman reminded me that quiet doesn't mean helpless." I sat with the letter a long time. Then I opened a new binder. Sentinel, Volume 2. That evening, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat in the reading room, the one Henry had painted sea green after retiring. The air was soft. The sun hung low. The phone rang. It was Grace. "There's a community center downtown that wants to partner. They've got space and a printer that actually works." I smiled. "Let's go see it." "You're not tired yet?" she asked. "No," I said. "For the first time in a long while, I'm not tired at all." After we hung up, I returned to the table and opened one of the thank you cards. Inside was a simple sentence, written in shaky pen. "We still have our home." I closed my eyes and breathed it in. That was all I'd ever wanted to hear. That someone, somewhere, got to keep what mattered. Not because they screamed the loudest, but because someone stood beside them and stood still. My name is Florence Whitmore. I'm 66 years old. And today, I walked barefoot on the beach for the first time in years. It was early, the kind of morning that wrapped itself in silver mist. The kind that Henry used to say was good for thinking. The waves came in quiet, rolling like breath. I stood where the wet sand met the dry, the hem of my linen skirt catching the breeze. In one hand, I held a single letter. In the other, my shoes. No one else was around. Just the gulls, the salt air, and the slow, honest hush of the sea. The letter had arrived 2 days prior. From Ethan. It was postmarked from the correctional facility upstate. A single sheet, folded neatly, in handwriting I hadn't seen in a year. "Mom, there's no apology that could ever carry the weight of what I did. But if I don't say it, it will rot me from the inside. I was blinded by pressure, by pride, by the wrong people and the wrong fears. I let someone else's ambition bury my own compass. And I turned on the one person who never once abandoned me. I remember the teacup. I remember your face when I raised my voice in that living room. I remember the letter from Dad. I've read it now. I keep it in my cell. They told me I'll be here for 8 more years, maybe 5 with good behavior. That's fine. I'm not writing to beg. I'm writing because I want to be the kind of man he hoped I'd become, even if I'm too late. You didn't deserve what I did. You never were a burden. You were the backbone. There was no signature, just a final line, written small. I hope you're walking near the water again. I folded the letter back into my coat pocket, and I walked, step by step, letting the cold reach my skin. The last year had felt like a quiet rebuilding, not of houses or careers, but of self. I'd lost a son to greed, and then found a boy again in a prison yard letter. I'd lost a name to a wedding tag, and gained something far more permanent, respect. I'd lost a teacup, but not what it stood for. I passed a patch of shore where children once ran, where Henry once knelt to draw hearts in the sand with his pocket knife. I stopped and crouched, smoothing the damp grains with my palm. I drew a heart, just once, then let the tide erase it. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I was ready to begin again. The Sentinel Foundation now had 3 full-time staff. Grace oversaw legal vetting. Margaret handled grant writing. We had a room with donated computers and a wall filled with framed thank you letters. Every Monday, I sat at the window and read aloud from Henry's binder. Sometimes people cried. Sometimes they just listened. But always, they stayed. One woman left behind a folded napkin with a note that read, "You reminded me I am not too late." The binder was almost full. Next to it sat a chipped saucer, carefully glued back together, holding chamomile tea and 2 butter cookies. One afternoon, I'd found a high school student sketching in the courthouse hallway. She'd been waiting for her grandmother's guardianship hearing. I sat beside her. We talked. She gave me the sketch. It now hung above my kitchen table. It was of an older woman, calm, barefoot, standing at the edge of the sea, holding a paper in one hand and nothing else. Her face was lined but strong. The ocean before her was wide. But she was not afraid. I knew who she was meant to be, and I was ready to be her. As the sun lifted behind the low clouds, light stretched across the sand like silk. I took the letter from my pocket one last time. Then I knelt and placed it under a stone, letting the corners flutter in the breeze. A gift to the ocean, a release. The tide would come for it eventually. And that was all right. Some things are meant to be carried. Some are meant to be let go. And some, like justice, like dignity, are meant to be lived. I turned back up the shore. Behind me, the sea whispered a hush so soft it felt like a blessing. And in that moment, I finally understood what Henry had written. Some battles are fought in silence, and silence is the loudest victory. So if you are watching this, if someone ever told you you were nothing, if they mocked your gift, your name, your age, your place at the table, know this: you are not forgotten, you are not too late. And silence, it isn't weakness. It's the sound of a woman rising, quietly, finally, completely. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with someone who might need this reminder. Silence can be strength.